At the divorce hearing, the husband kissed his mistress in front of everyone. Then his wife walked in. The rain drummed against the courthouse windows like an impatient heartbeat, each drop echoing the rhythm Grace Whitmore had learned to live with over the past 7 months. She sat in her modest Honda Civic in the parking lot, watching the gray February sky mirror the weight she'd carried since that devastating day when her world crumbled. 7 months, she whispered to herself, her fingers tracing the steering wheel. 7 months since she'd walked into Elliot's home office and found him on a video call with Ivy Rowland, their laughter intimate and careless. 7 months since her husband of 9 years had looked her in the eyes and said, "You're imagining things, Grace. You always do." But Grace wasn't imagining the lipstick stain on his collar that wasn't hers. She wasn't imagining the hotel receipts hidden in his briefcase, or the way Ivy had started appearing at every charity gala, every business dinner, standing just close enough to Elliot to claim territory. The courthouse loomed before her, its limestone facade weathered by decades of broken promises and shattered dreams. Today would be different, though. Today, Grace wasn't the naive woman who'd spent 9 years organizing Elliot's life, polishing his image, and believing his lies. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lauren Mayer, her attorney. "Ready when you are. Remember, let them underestimate you." Grace smiled for the first time in weeks. Lauren had been a godsend, recommended by Grace's sister Nora, when Grace finally found the courage to fight back. Where Elliot's team saw a quiet housewife, Lauren saw a woman who'd helped build an empire and deserved her share of it. She stepped out of the car, her black wool coat catching the wind. The heels she'd chosen were modest but purposeful, not the towering stilettos Ivy favored, but something that spoke of substance over spectacle. Grace had learned the difference. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations. Grace's heart hammered as she approached the family court wing, but her expression remained calm. She'd practiced this moment in the mirror for weeks. That's when she saw them. Elliot stood near the water fountain, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing the charcoal suit she'd helped him pick out for their anniversary 3 years ago. But it wasn't his appearance that made Grace's breath catch. It was the woman beside him. Ivy Rowland looked exactly like the Instagram photos that had tortured Grace during sleepless nights. Blonde hair cascading in perfect waves, a burgundy dress that cost more than most people's rent, and that practiced smile that had fooled thousands of followers into believing she was living an authentic life. But what shattered something deep inside Grace was the casual way Ivy's hand rested on Elliot's arm, the way she tilted her head toward him, claiming ownership, the way she laughed at something he whispered, as if they were at a cocktail party instead of the place where Grace's marriage would officially die. Elliot noticed Grace first. His expression shifted from casual arrogance to something harder, more calculated. He leaned down and said something to Ivy, who turned to look at Grace with eyes that held no remorse, no acknowledgement of the devastation she'd helped create. Grace kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble in a steady rhythm that sounded stronger than she felt. She didn't look away. She didn't hurry. She simply moved forward, the way she'd learned to do every day since her world fell apart. "Grace," Elliot called out, his voice carrying that familiar tone of forced politeness he used when he wanted to appear reasonable in public. She paused, turning to face the man she'd once loved with everything she had. "Elliot, you look tired," he said, and Grace caught the slight smirk that tugged at his lips. It was his way of pointing out that she looked older, worn down, less polished than the woman standing beside him. "Court proceedings can be exhausting," Grace replied evenly. "But then you'd know that better than most." Ivy's grip tightened on Elliot's arm, and Grace saw the flash of irritation cross the younger woman's features. Good. Let her feel uncomfortable. Let her wonder what Grace knew, what she was planning. "Well," Elliot said, his confidence returning as he pulled Ivy closer. "Let's hope this whole thing can be resolved quickly, for everyone's sake." Grace nodded once, then turned toward the courtroom doors. Behind her, she heard Ivy's whispered question. "Is she always so cold?" Elliot finished. "She's always been dramatic. You'll see." But as Grace pushed open the courtroom door, she smiled. If they thought she was cold now, they had no idea what winter truly felt like. And today, Grace Whitmore was about to show them exactly how powerful a quiet storm could be. What do you think Grace has planned that Elliot and Ivy don't see coming? Has a cheating spouse ever underestimated you like this? Share your thoughts below. Grace's revenge is just beginning, and you won't believe what happens next. The courtroom felt smaller than Grace remembered from their initial hearings. Wooden benches lined both sides, separated by a narrow aisle that seemed to stretch forever. She chose a seat in the third row, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to observe without being watched. Lauren Mayer was already at the plaintiff's table, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that meant business. At 36, Lauren had built a reputation that made divorce attorneys across Charlotte nervous. She didn't just win cases. She dismantled opponents piece by piece, always with a smile. Grace watched as Elliot's legal team filed in. Richard Blackstone led the group, a man whose silver mustache and expensive suits had intimidated Grace during their marriage. Beside him walked two younger associates, their arms full of briefcases and confident smirks. They think this is already over, Grace thought, remembering how Richard had cornered her at a charity auction 2 years ago, telling her she was lucky to have married up and should know her place. Today, he'd learn exactly what her place was. Elliot and Ivy entered together, and Grace's stomach clenched as she watched them. Ivy had changed into a navy blue dress, calculated modesty for the courtroom, but the neckline still dipped low enough to draw attention. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years performing for cameras. "Your Honor," Elliot said to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the room. He was performing too, Grace realized. Everything about him was performance, the concerned expression, the protective way he guided Ivy to their seats, even the way he straightened his tie. Lauren caught Grace's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. It was their signal. Everything was ready. Judge Harrison entered, a stern woman in her early 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for games. "Be seated," she said simply, and the room fell silent. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. 3 months ago, she'd sat in Lauren's office convinced she had nothing. No career, no income, no proof of her contributions to Elliot's success. "Tell me about the early days," Lauren had said during their first meeting. "Before the money, before the properties, before he became the Elliot Whitmore everyone knows now." And Grace had remembered. She'd remembered staying up until 3 a.m., helping him prepare proposals for his first major development deal. She'd remembered the dinner parties she'd hosted where Elliot made connections that led to million-dollar contracts. She'd remembered her suggestion to focus on sustainable housing that had become the cornerstone of his company's brand. Most importantly, she'd remembered the emails. Hundreds of emails where Elliot had praised her ideas, asked for her input, and credited her insights in messages to his business partners. Mrs. Whitmore kept everything, Lauren had said with satisfaction after reviewing Grace's meticulous records. Every email, every thank you note, every piece of correspondence that proves her role in building this empire. Now, as Judge Harrison called the court to order, Grace felt the weight of those discoveries. But it was Elliot's voice that pulled her back to the present. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to offer Mrs. Whitmore a generous settlement," Richard Blackstone announced, standing with theatrical flair. 20% of the marital assets plus monthly alimony for 2 years. "We believe this is more than fair, considering Mrs. Whitmore's limited contributions to the household income." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Lauren's hand touched her shoulder. A reminder to stay calm. "Limited contributions?" Lauren stood slowly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Your Honor, my client built this empire alongside Mr. Whitmore. She didn't just manage their home. She managed his image, his business relationships, and provided strategic insights that generated millions in revenue." Elliot leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk playing at his lips. Grace had seen that expression 1,000 times, usually right before he dismissed her ideas or reminded her who really made the decisions. "Ms. Mayer," Judge Harrison said, "I assume you have documentation to support these claims?" "Extensive documentation, Your Honor." Lauren moved to her table and lifted a thick folder. Emails spanning 7 years where Mr. Whitmore specifically asks for Mrs. Whitmore's business advice. Correspondence with clients where he credits her insights. Meeting notes from development projects where her ideas became the foundation for multi-million-dollar deals. Grace watched Elliot's smirk fade. He glanced at Richard, who was no longer looking quite so confident. But it was Ivy's reaction that surprised Grace most. The younger woman was staring at Elliot with something that looked like confusion, maybe even doubt, as if she was seeing him differently for the first time. "Furthermore," Lauren continued, "we have evidence of Mr. Whitmore's attempts to hide assets during the separation, including the transfer of properties to shell companies and the movement of funds to accounts in his girlfriend's name." The word "girlfriend" hung in the air like a slap. Grace saw Ivy flinch, her cheeks coloring pink. Elliot stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is character assassination. My personal relationships have nothing to do with—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said sharply. "You'll have your turn to speak." As Elliot sank back into his chair, Grace felt something shift in the room. The confidence that had walked in with him was cracking, and for the first time in months, Grace allowed herself to hope. But she wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy. Elliot was dangerous when cornered, and she could see him whispering urgently to Richard. Whatever they were planning, Grace was ready. She'd spent 7 months preparing for this moment, and she wasn't the same woman who'd discovered those hotel receipts. She was stronger now, smarter, and most importantly, she was no longer alone. Richard Blackstone's mustache twitched as he shuffled through his papers, the confident swagger from earlier replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like panic. Grace watched him lean toward Elliot, their whispered conversation growing more heated by the second. "Your Honor," Richard finally stood, clearing his throat. "My client would like to request a brief recess to review these allegations." Judge Harrison checked her watch. "Mr. Blackstone, you've had months to prepare for this hearing. Are you telling me you're unprepared to respond to documented evidence?" "No, Your Honor, but these claims about hidden assets are documented with bank statements and property records," Lauren interrupted smoothly, holding up another folder. "All obtained through proper legal channels, of course." Grace felt a small thrill watching Richard's face redden. This was the man who had once told her that women like her should be grateful for whatever they received in divorce proceedings. The same man who had suggested she think realistically about her future without Elliot's protection. Behind the defendant's table, Ivy shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Grace noticed how she kept glancing at the folder in Lauren's hands, then at Elliot, as if trying to piece together something that didn't quite fit. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison addressed Elliot directly. "According to these bank records, you transferred $2.3 million to various accounts in the weeks following your separation. Can you explain these transactions?" Elliot stood slowly, and Grace recognized the careful composure he used during difficult business negotiations. "Your Honor, those were legitimate business investments, market opportunities that required quick action." "Investments in companies owned by Ms. Rowland?" Lauren asked, her voice deceptively casual. The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Grace saw Ivy's head snap toward Elliot, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the shock in her eyes. That's not—" Elliot's usual eloquence deserted him. "Ms. Rowland is an entrepreneur. I've made several investments in emerging businesses, including her lifestyle brand, Ivy's Eden, which was incorporated just 6 weeks after your separation," Lauren pressed, "and the luxury travel blog that coincidentally launched with a $500,000 funding injection from your personal account." Grace had to bite her lip to keep from smiling. Lauren had been thorough, more thorough than Grace had dared hope. Every financial move Elliot thought he'd hidden had been tracked, documented, and cataloged, but it was Ivy's reaction that truly satisfied Grace. The younger woman was staring at Elliot with an expression Grace knew well, the look of someone realizing they'd been lied to, the same look Grace had worn when she'd confronted Elliot about his affair. "Elliot," Ivy whispered, her voice carrying in the silent courtroom. "You said those were loans. You said—" "Not now, Ivy," Elliot hissed, his mask of control slipping further. Judge Harrison's gaze sharpened. "Ms. Rowland, are you suggesting you were unaware of the source of funding for your businesses?" Ivy looked trapped, her eyes darting between Elliot and the judge. Grace almost felt sorry for her. Almost. We discussed various investment opportunities," Ivy said carefully. "I assumed it was separate from this situation. Yet you accepted over $800,000 in investments from a man in the middle of divorce proceedings." Lauren's tone was gentle, but the implications were devastating. Grace watched Ivy's composure crumble in real time. The confident influencer who had posed for selfies at charity galas was being revealed as either complicit in financial deception or embarrassingly naive about her boyfriend's business dealings. Elliot tried to regain control. "Your Honor, my business investments are separate from marital assets. I have every right to hide marital property by funneling it through your girlfriend's companies." Lauren's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "Because that's what these records show, Your Honor. Systematic concealment of assets that legally belong half to my client." Richard was on his feet now, his face flushed. "Objection. Ms. Mayer is making unfounded accusations about my client's business practices." "Are they unfounded?" Judge Harrison asked, studying the documents Lauren had submitted. These bank records appear quite clear about the timing and recipients of these transfers. Grace felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite triumph, but a growing sense of vindication. For months she'd questioned herself, wondered if she was being paranoid or vindictive, but here was proof that her instincts had been right all along. Elliot had always been controlling, but she'd never realized how calculating he truly was. Even his affair had been strategic, not just emotional betrayal, but financial positioning for the divorce he'd apparently been planning longer than she'd known. Your Honor, Elliot tried again, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had once charmed investors and city council members. Grace has never shown interest in business matters. She preferred to focus on domestic concerns. The dismissive phrase hit Grace like a physical blow, bringing back years of being talked over, ignored, and credited as nothing more than a hostess and decorator. But this time, instead of shrinking, she felt anger flare bright and clean. Lauren must have sensed it because she smiled, the kind of smile that made opposing attorneys nervous. Domestic concerns, Lauren repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you call the market research, Mrs. Whitmore conducted for your sustainable housing initiative? The research that led to your company being featured in Architectural Digest and resulted in $15 million in new contracts? Grace watched Elliot's jaw tighten. He'd forgotten about that article, forgotten how Grace had spent weeks researching environmental building trends and consumer preferences, how she'd presented him with a complete analysis that had transformed his company's direction. Or perhaps you mean her domestic concern for community outreach? Lauren continued. The relationships she built with local officials that secured the permits for your Riverside development project? With each revelation, Grace saw Elliot's carefully constructed narrative crumbling. But more importantly, she saw Ivy's expression changing from confusion to something harder, something that looked like recognition. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Harrison said finally, I'm scheduling a continuation of this hearing for next week. I suggest you use that time to provide a complete accounting of all financial transactions since your separation. All of them. As the judge's gavel fell, Grace felt a tremor of satisfaction. This was just the beginning, and already Elliot's world was showing cracks. But as they filed out of the courtroom, Grace caught Ivy's eye for just a moment. What she saw there wasn't hatred or jealousy anymore. It was doubt. And in Grace's experience, doubt was far more dangerous to men like Elliot than anger ever could be. The week between hearings passed like a slow-burning fuse. Grace found herself checking her phone obsessively, not for messages from Elliot. Those had stopped months ago, but for the inevitable explosion she sensed coming. She was right. It started on a Wednesday morning when her sister Nora called, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. Grace, you need to see this. Ivy just posted something on Instagram and it's, well, just look. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she opened the app. Ivy's usually pristine feed, filled with sponsored content, luxury travel shots, and carefully curated lifestyle photos, had been interrupted by something different. A simple black square with white text, sometimes the truth hurts more than the lies, reevaluating everything, authenticity, growth. The post had been up for only an hour, but the comments were already pouring in. Grace scrolled through them, each one a small revelation of how Ivy's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack. Girl, what happened? Are you okay? This doesn't sound like you. Trouble in paradise? Grace set her phone aside, but she couldn't stop thinking about Ivy's expression in the courtroom. The shock when Lauren had revealed the financial transfers. The way she'd stared at Elliot as if seeing him for the first time. That afternoon, Grace was organizing files in Lauren's office when her attorney's phone rang. Lauren answered with her usual professional tone, but Grace watched her expression shift from neutral to fascinated. Yes, I can meet with you, Lauren said carefully. My office tomorrow at 2 p.m. Grace looked up from the documents. Who was that? Lauren's smile was sharp as a blade. Ivy Rowland. She wants to talk. The next day, Grace positioned herself in the conference room adjacent to Lauren's office. Through the frosted glass, she could see two figures, Lauren's composed silhouette and another, smaller form that paced nervously near the window. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Ivy's hands moved constantly, gesturing, touching her hair, wrapping her arms around herself. The confident influencer from the courtroom had been replaced by someone who looked lost. An hour later, Lauren knocked on the conference room door. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Grace caught the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Well? Grace asked. She knows about the others. Lauren said simply. Grace felt the world tilt slightly. Others? Apparently our Miss Rowland has been doing some detective work since our last hearing. She found emails on Elliot's laptop. Emails to other women. Lots of other women. Lauren sat down across from Grace, her expression serious. Grace, what we discovered in court was just the tip of the iceberg. The revelation hit Grace like cold water. She'd known about Ivy, had suspected there might have been others, but confirmation was different. It made her feel naive and foolish, but also strangely relieved. It wasn't about her inadequacies, it was about Elliot's character. What else did she find? Bank statements showing regular payments to at least 3 different women over the past 2 years. Hotel receipts from cities where he claimed to be alone on business. And most damaging, Lauren paused, seeming to savor the moment. A recorded conversation between Elliot and Richard where they discuss hiding assets not just from you, but from the IRS. Grace's breath caught. Tax evasion? Among other things. Ivy recorded it on her phone when she became suspicious. She was smart enough to document everything before confronting him. Grace thought about the young woman she'd seen in the courtroom, remembering her own naivety in the early days of her marriage. What does she want? Immunity, mostly. She's terrified of being charged as an accessory to financial fraud. But more than that, Lauren leaned forward. She wants revenge. Apparently, Elliot told her some very unflattering things about you during their relationship. Things that painted you as unstable, vindictive, someone who was trying to destroy him out of spite. And now she knows better. Now she knows he's been lying to everyone, including her. Lauren's smile was predatory. Grace. She's willing to testify. About the hidden assets, the other affairs, even about how Elliot coached her on what to say if anyone asked about their relationship. Grace felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction at the vindication, but also an unexpected pity for Ivy. The younger woman had been manipulated just as thoroughly as Grace had been, just in different ways. There's more, Lauren continued. She's willing to provide access to all of Elliot's financial records, the real ones he kept on his personal laptop, the ones that show where every penny went. Grace stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Charlotte skyline. Somewhere out there, Elliot was probably in his office, still believing he was in control of the narrative. Still thinking he could charm his way through the legal proceedings like he'd charmed his way through everything else. What happens now? Now we have enough evidence to bury him. Not just in divorce court, but potentially in criminal court as well. Lauren's voice carried a note of professional satisfaction. The question is, how far do you want to take this? Grace thought about the 9 years she'd spent making excuses for Elliot's behavior, explaining away his absences, his mood swings, his casual cruelty. She thought about the nights she'd lain awake wondering what she'd done wrong, how she could be better, more supportive, more understanding. She thought about the woman she'd been before Elliot, confident, ambitious, full of ideas and dreams. And then she thought about the woman she was becoming, stronger, wiser, unwilling to accept less than she deserved. I want justice, she said finally. Real justice. For me, for Ivy, for every woman he's lied to and manipulated. Lauren nodded approvingly. Then we'd better get to work. Because when Elliot realizes what Ivy has done, he's going to fight dirty. Men like him always do when they're cornered. As if summoned by her words, Grace's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was blocked, but the message was unmistakably Elliot's style. Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. I'll destroy you before I let you take what's mine. Grace showed the message to Lauren, who immediately screenshot it. Threats? Lauren asked, adding the image to Grace's case file. How very predictable. Grace deleted the message and turned back to the window. Let him threaten. Let him rage. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of Elliot Whitmore, because now she wasn't fighting him alone. And more importantly, she finally understood that this had never been about her worthiness or her failures. It had always been about his. Grace knew Elliot was unraveling before she even saw him. The signs were everywhere. Missed business meetings reported in the local business journal, angry voicemails left on her sister's phone when he couldn't reach Grace directly, and most telling of all, the complete radio silence from his social media accounts. Elliot Whitmore had built his empire on image, and when that image cracked, everything else followed. The second hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. Grace arrived early, settling into her usual spot with a calmness that surprised her. 3 weeks ago, her hands would have been shaking. Today they were steady as she opened the folder Lauren had prepared. Inside were Ivy's recordings, 3 separate conversations where Elliot discussed hiding assets, manipulating tax records, and most damning of all, his strategy for managing Grace's expectations during the divorce. "She's always been dramatic," his voice had said through Ivy's phone speaker. "If we give her enough to feel like she won something small, she'll take it and disappear. Grace has never had the spine to fight for anything real." Hearing those words in Lauren's office had felt like a final door closing on any remaining love Grace might have harbored for her soon-to-be ex-husband. Not because of the cruelty, but because of how fundamentally wrong he was about who she'd become. The courtroom door opened, and Grace looked up expecting to see Elliot's usual confident entrance. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. His suit was expensive but wrinkled, his silver hair slightly unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness she'd never seen before. Behind him, Richard Blackstone looked like a man preparing for his own execution, but it was the absence that spoke loudest. Ivy was nowhere to be seen. "Where's his girlfriend?" Nora whispered beside Grace. Grace almost smiled. Probably somewhere safe. Lauren had arranged for Ivy to stay at a hotel outside Charlotte under an assumed name. The younger woman had been receiving increasingly frantic calls and texts from Elliot since their last encounter, each one more desperate and threatening than the last. Judge Harrison entered with her usual no-nonsense demeanor. "Mr. Blackstone, I trust you've had adequate time to prepare your client's financial disclosure?" Richard stood slowly, and Grace could see his hands trembling as he shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, my client maintains that the allegations against him are exaggerated and—" "Mr. Blackstone," the judge interrupted, "I asked for financial disclosure, not editorial commentary. Do you have the requested documents or not?" "We have partial documentation, Your Honor. Some records were compromised." Grace felt Lauren's satisfied energy beside her. They'd both known this moment would come, the moment when Elliot's lies became so tangled he couldn't keep them straight. Compromised how? Judge Harrison's tone could have frozen water. Elliot stood abruptly, ignoring Richard's restraining hand. "Your Honor, my estranged wife and her attorney have been working with a woman who has clear motives to fabricate evidence against me. Ivy Rowland is unstable, vindictive, and—" "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said sharply. "Sit down. Your attorney will speak for you." But Elliot was past taking direction. The control he'd wielded so effortlessly for years was slipping through his fingers, and Grace could see the panic underneath his anger. "This is a setup," he continued, his voice rising. "Grace has always been jealous, manipulative. She's using this girl to destroy me because she can't stand that I found someone better." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace felt the familiar sting of his casual cruelty, but this time it bounced off her like rain on stone. Because sitting in that courtroom, watching him implode, she finally understood the truth. Elliot wasn't a master manipulator who had slowly worn down her self-worth over 9 years. He was a desperate, frightened man who had built his entire identity on controlling others, and when that control slipped, he had nothing left. "Your Honor," Lauren stood with deadly calm, "I'd like to present evidence that directly contradicts Mr. Whitmore's characterization of both my client and Ms. Rowland." She activated a small speaker on her table, and Elliot's voice filled the courtroom, clear, confident, and utterly damning. "Grace is useful, but she's not going anywhere. Women like her don't leave. They're too scared, too dependent. Even if she tries to divorce me, she'll take whatever scraps I throw her and be grateful." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace watched Elliot's face cycle through shock, rage, and something that looked like genuine fear. "That recording was taken without my consent," he said desperately. "It's inadmissible. It's perfectly legal," Lauren said smoothly. "Recorded by Ms. Rowland in her own home with her own property, during a conversation she was a party to. North Carolina is a one-party consent state, Mr. Whitmore." Judge Harrison studied the transcript Lauren had provided. "Mr. Whitmore, this recording suggests you've been deliberately concealing assets while expressing confidence that your wife wouldn't fight for her legal rights. Would you care to explain this strategy?" Grace watched Elliot look frantically at Richard, who was studying his papers as if they might contain a miracle. When no help came, Elliot's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. "She doesn't deserve anything," he shouted. "I built everything while she sat at home playing house. I made the money, I took the risks, I created the success. Grace was just decoration." The word hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Grace felt something inside her chest expand, not pain, but a fierce, bright clarity. Every doubt she'd ever had about her worth, every moment she'd questioned whether she deserved better, crystallized into absolute certainty. She was done being anyone's decoration. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Harrison's voice cut through his rant like a blade. You will control yourself in my courtroom or you will be removed. But Elliot was beyond control now. You want to know the truth? The truth is that Grace is pathetic. She has no skills, no talent, no value without me. And now she thinks she can take half of everything I built? She's going to learn what the real world thinks of women like her. The courtroom erupted. Richard was on his feet trying to silence his client. Lauren was objecting to the hostile statements, and bailiffs were moving toward Elliot as his voice grew louder and more threatening. But Grace remained perfectly still, watching the man she'd once loved reveal himself completely. Not to her. She'd seen glimpses of this before, but to everyone else. To the judge, to the court reporter, to the gallery full of people who would remember this moment. That's enough, Judge Harrison declared, her gavel cracking like a gunshot. Mr. Whitmore, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort him out. As the bailiffs approached, Elliot's wild eyes found Grace across the courtroom. For just a moment, his expression shifted from rage to something that looked almost like pleading. But Grace looked back at him with eyes that held no anger, no hurt, no lingering attachment. She looked at him the way she might look at a stranger having a breakdown in public, with detached pity. And in that moment, Elliot Whitmore realized what Grace had already learned, that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who has hurt you is to stop caring about their opinion of your worth. As the bailiffs led him from the courtroom, Grace heard him calling her name, but she didn't turn around. She was already looking toward her future. The courtroom felt different after Elliot's removal, cleaner somehow, as if his toxic presence had been physically extracted from the air. Grace sat in the sudden quiet, watching Judge Harrison review the documents Lauren had submitted while Elliot raged his way out of the building. Richard Blackstone looked like a man who'd watched his career implode in real time. His remaining associates whispered frantically among themselves, probably calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from this disaster. Ms. Mayer, Judge Harrison said finally, I assume you have additional evidence to present? Lauren stood with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. Yes, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to call Ms. Ivy Rowland as a witness. Grace turned as the courtroom doors opened. Ivy walked in wearing a simple gray suit that was elegant without being flashy, a far cry from the attention-seeking outfits she'd worn during her relationship with Elliot. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a modest bun, and her makeup was minimal. But it was her posture that struck Grace most. 3 weeks ago, Ivy had moved through the world like someone performing for an invisible camera. Today, she walked like someone who had stopped caring about the performance. Ivy took the witness stand with steady hands, her voice clear as she was sworn in. Grace found herself studying this woman who had been a source of so much pain, looking for signs of the manipulative seductress Elliot had chosen over his wife. Instead, she saw someone who looked tired, hurt, and determined to tell the truth. Ms. Rowland, Lauren began gently. How long were you in a relationship with Mr. Whitmore? 14 months, Ivy replied. From December 2023 until February of this year. And during that time, were you aware that Mr. Whitmore was married? Ivy's cheeks colored slightly. Not initially. He told me he was separated and that his divorce was already finalized. I believed him for the first 6 months of our relationship. Grace felt a strange mixture of vindication and sympathy. Elliot's lies had been so comprehensive, so carefully constructed, that even his mistress had been deceived. When did you learn the truth? When we attended a charity gala together and someone mentioned his wife. When I asked him about it later, he said Grace was unstable, that she was refusing to accept the divorce and making his life difficult. Ivy's voice grew smaller. He said she was spreading lies about him to try to destroy his reputation. And you believed him? I wanted to believe him, Ivy admitted. I was in love with him, or I thought I was. Looking back, I think I was in love with the version of himself he presented to me. Lauren moved closer to the witness stand. Ms. Rowland, did Mr. Whitmore ever ask you to help him hide assets during the divorce proceedings? Yes. The word came out firm and clear. He transferred money to accounts in my name, claiming it was investment capital for my business ventures. He said it was better to keep certain assets separate until Grace stopped being vindictive. Grace watched Richard frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out how to salvage anything from this testimony. How much money did you receive from Mr. Whitmore? Over $800,000 across 8 months. He told me it was his personal money, completely separate from any marital assets. Ivy's voice carried a note of shame. I should have questioned it more, but he was very persuasive. Did you keep records of these transfers? Yes. and I've returned every penny to a court-supervised account as soon as I realized what was actually happening. Grace felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Ivy had been as much a victim of Elliot's manipulation as she had been. Lauren continued her questioning, methodically building a picture of Elliot's deception. Ivy testified about the other women she'd discovered. Names, dates, financial transactions. She spoke about the lavish trips Elliot had taken during their business meetings, using marital funds to wine and dine his various affairs. But it was her final testimony that hit hardest. "Ms. Rowland," Lauren said, "did Mr. Whitmore ever express his feelings about his wife to you?" Ivy glanced toward Grace, then away. "Many times. He said Grace was boring, clingy, intellectually inferior. He called her a trophy wife who forgot she was just for show." Grace felt the words land like physical blows, but strangely, they hurt less than she'd expected. Hearing Elliot's cruelty laid bare in front of everyone somehow diminished its power over her. "He said she had no real skills or talents," Ivy continued, her voice growing stronger, "that she'd contributed nothing meaningful to his success and would be nothing without him." "Did you believe these characterizations?" "At the time, yes. Elliot was very convincing about everything." Ivy's voice cracked slightly. "But after spending time reviewing their history together, after seeing the emails and documents that showed her real contributions to his business, I realized he'd been lying about her just like he'd been lying about everything else." Lauren returned to her table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present exhibits that demonstrate the systematic nature of Mr. Whitmore's asset concealment and his pattern of manipulation." For the next hour, Grace watched as her life was dissected and rebuilt. Not the version Elliot had constructed where she was a helpless dependent, but the truth. Bank records showing her financial contributions to early business ventures, email chains where Elliot credited her ideas and insights, contracts she'd negotiated, relationships she'd built, strategies she'd developed. It was like watching herself be resurrected. "Furthermore," Lauren continued, "we have evidence that Mr. Whitmore has been systematically undervaluing shared assets while inflating his personal debts to reduce the apparent value of the marital estate." Richard made a weak attempt at objection, but Judge Harrison overruled him with barely concealed irritation. "Ms. Mayer, what remedy are you seeking for your client?" Grace held her breath. This was the moment everything had been building toward. "Your Honor, given the extensive evidence of asset concealment, tax evasion, and deliberate deception, we're seeking an unequal distribution of marital assets. Specifically, we believe Mrs. Whitmore is entitled to 75% of all marital property, including the family home, the primary business assets, and all retirement accounts. We're also seeking punitive spousal support reflecting the deliberate economic harm Mr. Whitmore has attempted to inflict on my client, and immediate restraining orders preventing any further contact or harassment." Grace felt her heart hammering against her ribs. 75% seemed impossible, unthinkable. Women like her didn't win that big, didn't walk away with that much power. But as she looked around the courtroom, at Ivy's relieved expression, at Richard's defeat, at Lauren's quiet confidence, Grace realized that maybe women like her did win when they stopped accepting less than they deserved, when they stopped believing the lies men like Elliot told them about their worth. Judge Harrison was reviewing the financial documents, her expression growing more severe with each page. When she finally looked up, her eyes held the cold fury of someone who'd seen one too many men try to game the system. "This court will recess for 1 hour while I review these materials in detail," she announced. "We will reconvene at 3 p.m. for my decision." As the courtroom emptied, Grace remained in her seat, too stunned to move. Lauren sat beside her, silent but supportive. "How do you feel?" her attorney asked quietly. Grace considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she would have felt guilty for seeking so much, worried about being seen as greedy or vindictive. But sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by evidence of her own worth and Elliot's betrayal, she felt something entirely different. She felt ready to claim what had always been hers. The hour felt like a lifetime. Grace found herself in a small cafe across from the courthouse, stirring coffee she couldn't taste while Lauren fielded phone calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the explosive testimony. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace looked up to find Ivy standing hesitantly beside her table, looking more uncertain than Grace had ever seen her. "May I sit?" Ivy asked. "I understand if you'd rather not, but I need to say something." Grace gestured to the empty chair, curious despite herself. Up close, without the armor of designer clothes and professional makeup, Ivy looked younger, more human. "I know this doesn't change anything," Ivy began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know saying sorry isn't enough for what I helped him do to you. But I need you to know that I had no idea about your contributions to his business, about how he really talked about you, about any of it." Grace studied Ivy's face, looking for traces of the confident woman who'd hung on Elliot's arm at public events. "What changed your mind?" "The emails," Ivy said simply. "When I went through his laptop, I found years of correspondence between you two. The way he asked for your advice, the way he credited your ideas and messages to his business partners. It was like reading about a completely different person than the one he described to me." Ivy's hands twisted in her lap. "He told me you were lazy, unintelligent, that you'd never worked a day in your life. But those emails showed someone brilliant, someone who was essentially his unpaid business consultant for years. And that's when you decided to help Lauren? That's when I realized I'd been dating a stranger. Everything he told me about you, about your marriage, about why you were divorcing, all lies." Ivy's voice grew stronger. "I started wondering what else he'd lied about. That's when I found the other women." Grace felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "How many others?" "6 that I could prove. Probably more." Ivy's laugh was bitter. "Turns out I wasn't special. I was just the latest in a very long line of women he used and discarded." They sat in silence for a moment. Two women who'd been manipulated by the same man finally seeing each other clearly. "What will you do now?" Grace asked. "Start over. My business, my reputation, my relationships. Elliot contaminated everything. But maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe I needed to lose the fake life to find a real one." Grace's phone buzzed with a text from Lauren. "Time to go back. Are you ready?" As they walked back to the courthouse together, Ivy spoke once more. "Grace, for what it's worth, I think you're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're stronger than he ever gave you credit for." Grace nodded, surprised by how much those words meant coming from someone who'd seen Elliot's manipulation from the inside. The courtroom was packed when they returned. Word had spread about the morning's testimony, and Grace recognized several faces from Charlotte's business community in the gallery. People who'd attended parties at her and Elliot's house, who'd benefited from the connections and events she'd organized. Judge Harrison entered promptly at 3 p.m., her expression giving nothing away. Grace felt her heart hammering as everyone rose, then sat in unison. "I've reviewed all evidence presented to this court," the judge began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This case represents one of the most egregious examples of asset concealment and spousal manipulation I've encountered in 20 years on the bench." Grace felt Lauren's hand briefly touch her arm, a gesture of support. Mr. Whitmore's behavior, both during this marriage and throughout these proceedings, demonstrates a pattern of financial deception, emotional manipulation, and deliberate attempts to deny his wife her legal rights to marital property. Grace could hear rustling in the gallery behind her, whispered conversations as Charlotte's elite processed what they were hearing about one of their own. Furthermore, the evidence presented shows that Mrs. Whitmore was not merely a passive beneficiary of Mr. Whitmore's success, but an active contributor whose ideas, connections, and business acumen were instrumental in building the wealth that Mr. Whitmore now claims as solely his own. Judge Harrison paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "The court finds that Mr. Whitmore has systematically undervalued Mrs. Whitmore's contributions while simultaneously attempting to hide marital assets through fraudulent transfers and shell companies." Grace's breath caught. This was it. Therefore, this court awards Mrs. Grace Whitmore 80% of all marital assets, including the family residence at 2847 Magnolia Drive, 80% of Whitmore Development Group's assets and future earnings, all retirement accounts, and the lake house in Boone, 80%. Grace felt the number hit her like a physical force. She'd hoped for fair, dreamed of 60%, but 80% was complete vindication. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Additionally, Mr. Whitmore will pay spousal support in the amount of $15,000 per month for a period of 10 years, given his deliberate attempts to leave Mrs. Whitmore financially vulnerable. Grace heard gasps from the gallery, the scratch of reporters' pens, but it all seemed to come from very far away. This court also grants Mrs. Whitmore's request for a comprehensive restraining order. Mr. Whitmore is prohibited from contacting Mrs. Whitmore directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of her residence or workplace. and from making any disparaging public statements about her character or contributions to their shared success. The judge's gavel came down with finality. This marriage is hereby dissolved. Mrs. Whitmore, you are free to resume your maiden name if you choose, though you retain the right to use the Whitmore name in any business capacity given your documented contributions to that brand. The courtroom erupted. Grace sat in stunned silence as voices rose around her, reporters asking questions, gallery members expressing shock, Lauren speaking rapidly to someone on her phone. But through it all, Grace felt a profound quiet settling over her. Not the silence of defeat she'd lived with for so long, but the peace of justice finally served. Grace? Lauren's voice cut through the noise. How do you feel? Grace stood slowly, testing her legs, her resolve, her new reality. Through the courthouse windows, she could see Charlotte spread out below, a city where she'd lived in Elliot's shadow for 9 years. But that shadow was gone now, burned away by the bright light of truth. Free, Grace said simply. I feel free. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Grace caught sight of a familiar figure near the back of the courtroom. Elliot stood in the doorway, his face pale with shock, his expensive suit wrinkled from his earlier outburst. Their eyes met across the room, and Grace saw something in his expression she'd never seen before, the recognition that he'd lost completely. Not just the money, not just the assets, but the narrative he'd built about who he was and who she was. Grace didn't look away. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see the woman he'd underestimated for the last time. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor, leaving Elliot Whitmore behind forever. 2 weeks after the trial, Grace stood in the marble foyer of what was now legally her home, watching movers carry out the last of Elliot's belongings. The restraining order meant he couldn't be present, so his assistant supervised the removal of his clothes, personal items, and the collection of expensive watches he'd accumulated over the years. Everything else stayed with Grace. Everything. The house felt different without his presence, larger somehow, as if it could finally breathe. Grace walked through rooms that had been carefully curated to reflect Elliot's taste, his status, his image of himself as a successful man. Now she was free to make them hers. Her phone rang constantly, reporters wanting statements, business associates offering congratulations or attempting to gauge whether she planned to maintain Elliot's partnerships. Most interesting were the calls from other women. Some she knew, some she didn't, all wanting to share their own stories about Elliot's behavior over the years. Grace was beginning to understand that her ex-husband's pattern of manipulation extended far beyond his romantic relationships. Mrs. Whitmore? The moving supervisor appeared in the doorway. We're finished. Mr. Whitmore's assistant asked me to give you this. He handed her an envelope with her name written in Elliot's distinctive handwriting. Grace waited until the movers left before opening it. Grace, I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. You've destroyed a good man's reputation over a few mistakes. When you realize what you've thrown away, don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces. Elliot Grace read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace and fed it to the flames. Even in defeat, Elliot couldn't acknowledge what he'd done wrong. He was still the victim in his own narrative, still convinced that his actions were merely mistakes, rather than deliberate choices. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Grace opened it to find Lauren standing on her doorstep with a bottle of champagne and a stack of papers. Legal documents? Grace asked, gesturing her inside. The good kind. Elliot's business partners have been calling all morning. Apparently, several major clients are threatening to pull their contracts unless Whitmore Development Group undergoes significant restructuring. Lauren's smile was sharp. They want to offer you a controlling interest in the company. Grace felt her eyebrows rise. Controlling interest? The judge awarded you 80% of marital assets, which includes Elliot's stake in the company, but his partners are offering to buy out his remaining shares and give you majority control. They're more afraid of the bad publicity he's generating than they are of working with his ex-wife. Grace walked to the window overlooking the garden she'd designed and maintained for 9 years. The irony wasn't lost on her. The business community that had once seen her as merely Elliot's decorative wife now wanted her leadership. What about Elliot? He'd be completely bought out. No role in the company, no decision-making power, no connection to the Whitmore Development brand. Lauren paused. Grace, this is more than financial vindication. This is you taking control of the empire you helped build. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Grace had spent so many years supporting Elliot's vision, organizing his life, facilitating his success. But did she have what it took to lead? I need to think about it. she said. Lauren nodded. Take your time. But Grace, don't let his voice in your head make this decision. You know the business better than anyone. You know the clients, the projects, the vision. The only question is whether you want it. After Lauren left, Grace walked through the house with new eyes. This wasn't just her home anymore. It was her headquarters, her base of operations for whatever came next. She found herself in Elliot's former study, a room she'd rarely entered during their marriage. It was all dark wood and leather, designed to project masculine authority. But the large windows faced east, catching the morning light beautifully. Grace began opening drawers, not snooping but reclaiming. In the bottom drawer of his desk, she found a folder labeled Personal EW. Inside were documents she'd never seen, copies of emails between Elliot and his attorney from early in their separation, discussing strategy for managing Grace's expectations. She's never been involved in the real business decisions, one email read. Her contributions were primarily social, organizing events, maintaining relationships, important for image, but not strategic. She'll accept a modest settlement rather than fight. Grace felt a familiar anger flare, but this time it burned clean and bright. They'd been so wrong about her. All of them. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Ivy. I know we're not exactly friends, but I thought you should know. Elliot's been telling people the trial was rigged, that you fabricated evidence. Just thought you should be prepared. Grace typed back, let him talk. The truth speaks louder. Ivy's response came quickly. You're stronger than I ever was. I'm rooting for you. As evening approached, Grace found herself back in the living room where she and Elliot had entertained Charlotte's elite for years. She remembered standing in corners of her own home, listening to conversations about business deals she'd helped strategize, watching Elliot take credit for ideas she'd developed. But she also remembered the moments when her true self had shone through, the conversations with clients' wives that had led to major contracts, the community connections that had opened doors, the instincts about market trends that had guided successful projects. All of that knowledge, all those relationships, all that experience, it was hers. It had always been hers. Grace picked up her phone and called Lauren. I'll do it, she said, when her attorney answered. I want controlling interest in the company. Are you sure? Grace looked around the room that would soon be redecorated to reflect her taste, her vision, her values. I've been preparing for this my whole life. I just didn't know it. Elliot's going to lose his mind when he finds out. Grace smiled, and for the first time in months it felt genuine. Good. Maybe it's time he learned what it feels like to be underestimated. As she hung up, Grace felt a shift inside herself, the final piece of her transformation clicking into place. She wasn't just reclaiming her financial security or her independence. She was reclaiming her power, and this time, she intended to use it. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Whitmore Development Group headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in downtown Charlotte that Grace had helped design the interior of 5 years ago. As the new majority owner and CEO, she was about to make her first public appearance in her new role. Grace stood in the executive bathroom, adjusting the navy blue suit she'd chosen carefully. Professional but not severe, confident but not arrogant. The woman looking back at her in the mirror bore little resemblance to the uncertain housewife who'd discovered her husband's affair 14 months ago. Lauren appeared in the doorway. The conference room is packed. Business reporters, local news, and about half of Charlotte's development community. Are you ready? Grace took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. They walked through corridors lined with photos documenting the company's projects over the past decade. Grace recognized her own work in many of them. Community outreach initiatives she'd spearheaded, sustainable design elements she'd suggested, client relationships she'd cultivated. For years, these had been presented as Elliot's achievements. Today, that narrative would change. The conference room buzzed with conversation that died as Grace entered. She recognized most of the faces, reporters who'd covered Elliot's business dealings for years, competitors who'd underestimated her at industry events, clients who'd credited her husband with ideas that had originated at her kitchen table. Ladies and gentlemen, Lauren began, I'd like to introduce Grace Whitmore, the new CEO and majority owner of Whitmore Development Group. The questions came fast and sharp. Mrs. Whitmore, how do you respond to allegations that you used the divorce proceedings to steal your ex-husband's company? Grace leaned into the microphone, her voice steady. I didn't steal anything that wasn't already mine. The court's decision reflects my documented contributions to this company over the past 9 years. Every major project, every client relationship, every strategic direction, I was involved in developing them all. What about Mr. Whitmore's claims that you're unqualified to run a development company? I find it interesting that my qualifications are being questioned now, when my ideas and insights were never questioned when they were generating millions in revenue under my ex-husband's name. Grace's tone remained professional, but there was steel beneath it. I have a master's degree in urban planning from Duke University, which I completed while married. I have 9 years of hands-on experience in every aspect of this business. The only thing that's changed is whose name is on the door. A reporter in the back raised her hand. There are rumors that several major clients are threatening to pull their contracts. How do you plan to address that? Grace smiled, and several people in the room seemed surprised by how genuine it looked. Actually, I spent yesterday meeting with our top 5 clients. 4 of them have already confirmed they're staying with us long-term. The 5th wants to expand their contract. She saw surprise ripple through the room. They'd expected chaos, uncertainty, a company in freefall. Instead, they were seeing a smooth transition led by someone who understood the business better than they'd realized. Mrs. Whitmore, another reporter called out, your ex-husband has been quite vocal about his intentions to start a competing firm. Are you concerned about his ability to poach clients and employees? Grace had been waiting for this question. I'm sure Mr. Whitmore will do whatever he feels is best for his future. As for our clients and employees, they're free to make their own choices. But I'm confident that those who value integrity, innovation, and authentic relationships will choose to stay with us. The subtle dig landed perfectly. Elliot's reputation had been shredded during the trial, and everyone in the room knew it. What's your vision for the company moving forward? This was the question Grace had prepared for most carefully. We're expanding our focus on sustainable, community-centered development. Too much of this industry has been about building monuments to ego rather than creating spaces where people actually want to live and work. That changes now. She outlined plans for affordable housing initiatives, green building standards, and community partnership programs, projects she'd proposed to Elliot repeatedly over the years, only to be told they weren't profitable enough or prestigious enough. We're also implementing new transparency standards for all our business practices. Every contract, every partnership, every financial decision will be documented and auditable. We're building a company based on trust, not just profit. Another reporter raised his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, there are those who say you're only in this position because of a vindictive divorce. How do you respond to claims that this is just revenge against your ex-husband? Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. Revenge would be trying to destroy someone out of spite. Justice is claiming what was always rightfully yours. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in building something better than what came before. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, but Grace could feel the room's energy shifting. The skepticism was giving way to genuine curiosity, even respect. These people were beginning to see her not as Elliot's wronged wife, but as a business leader in her own right. As the conference wound down, Grace noticed a commotion near the back of the room. The crowd was parting, and through the gap, she saw a familiar figure pushing his way forward. Elliot. He looked terrible, unshaven, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, but his eyes burned with a fury that made several people step back. You want to talk about justice? He shouted, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. This woman destroyed a good man's life because she couldn't handle being left for someone better. Security moved toward him, but Grace held up a hand. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. Elliot, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. You're in violation of a restraining order. You need to leave. I built this company, he continued, ignoring the cameras now focused on him. Every success, every achievement, every dollar. It was my work, my vision, my sacrifice. And now you're stealing it all because some feminist judge felt sorry for you. The room was dead silent. Everyone watching this public meltdown from a man who'd once been Charlotte's golden boy of development. Grace walked around the conference table, moving closer to him, with the confidence of someone who no longer feared his approval or his anger. You're right about one thing, she said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. You did work hard to build this company, but you didn't do it alone, and you didn't do it honestly. She stopped just outside the reach of security, looking Elliot directly in the eyes. I was there for every late-night strategy session, every client dinner, every crisis that needed solving. I was there when you doubted yourself, when you needed advice, when you needed someone to tell you that your ideas were good enough. I was your partner in everything except the credit. Elliot's face was red with rage. You were my wife, It was your job to support me, and it was your job to honor and respect me. But instead you chose to lie, cheat, and steal from me, from your clients, from the government. Grace's voice remained steady, professional. The court didn't give me this company out of pity, Elliot. They gave it to me because I earned it. You'll never be able to run this place without me, he snarled. You'll fail, and everyone will see what you really are. A pathetic woman who destroyed her marriage because she was too weak to keep her husband interested. The words were designed to wound, to reduce her to the insecure wife she'd once been. But Grace felt them bounce off her like rain on stone. Maybe I will fail, she said calmly. But if I do, it will be my failure, based on my decisions, my leadership, my vision. And honestly, I'd rather fail as myself than succeed as your shadow. Security finally reached Elliot, gently but firmly escorting him toward the exit. As they led him away, he called back one final threat. This isn't over, Grace. You'll regret this. Grace watched him go, feeling nothing but pity for the man who'd once controlled her entire world. When the doors closed behind him, she turned back to the room full of reporters and business associates. Any other questions? She asked with a slight smile. The room erupted in appreciative laughter, and Grace knew that something fundamental had shifted. Not just in her life, but in how Charlotte's business community saw her. She was no longer Elliot Whitmore's ex-wife. She was Grace Whitmore, CEO, and she was just getting started. 6 months later, Grace stood on the balcony of her corner office, Elliot's former domain, watching the Charlotte skyline stretch toward the horizon. The autumn light cast everything in gold, including the construction site across the street where Whitmore Development's latest project was taking shape. The Riverside Community Center would be their first fully sustainable, affordable housing complex, complete with shared gardens, solar panels, and spaces designed for actual families, rather than magazine photo shoots. It was everything Grace had dreamed of building when she'd first fallen in love with urban planning, before her ideas had been filtered through Elliot's ego and profit margins. Grace? Her assistant Marcus appeared in the doorway. The Charlotte Business Journal is here for your interview. Grace nodded, smoothing her forest green dress, a color Elliot had always hated because he said it made her look too earthy. Now it was one of her favorites. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of transformation. 3 major clients had not only stayed but expanded their contracts after working directly with Grace. 2 competitors had approached her about partnerships. Most satisfying of all, the company's employee satisfaction scores had reached an all-time high. Elliot's promised competing firm had never materialized. After his public meltdown at the press conference, his reputation in Charlotte's business community was beyond repair. The last Grace had heard, he'd moved to Atlanta, supposedly starting over in a new market where people didn't know his history. Ivy had sent a single text message 2 months ago. Saw the Business Journal article about your company's growth. Proud of you. I'm in therapy now, figuring out who I am when I'm not performing for someone else. Grace had responded simply, good for you. Be well. The reporter was younger than Grace had expected, probably in her late 20s, with the eager energy of someone building her career. Her name was Jessica Chen, and she'd clearly done her research. Mrs. Whitmore, your company's growth since the transition has been remarkable. Revenue up 40%, 3 major new projects, and industry recognition for innovation. How do you explain this success? Grace settled into her chair, completely comfortable in a way she'd never been during the choreographed interviews of her marriage. When you're no longer spending energy maintaining someone else's ego, you have a lot more bandwidth for actual leadership. Jessica laughed. That's quite a shift from your previous role. Do you miss anything about not being the one in charge? I was never not in charge, Grace corrected gently. I was just letting someone else take credit for being in charge. There's a difference. As for missing it, no, I don't miss performing a smaller version of myself to make someone else comfortable. Your ex-husband has been notably quiet since your press conference. Any thoughts on his current situation? Grace considered her words carefully. I hope Elliot finds whatever peace he's looking for, but my focus is on building something positive, not looking backward at something destructive. Speaking of building, the Riverside project has generated significant attention. Some are calling it revolutionary for affordable housing design. It's not revolutionary, it's just ethical. Good design shouldn't be a luxury item. People deserve beautiful, functional spaces regardless of their income level. Grace gestured toward the window. For too long, this industry has been about building monuments to wealth. I'm more interested in building communities. Jessica scribbled notes. You've also implemented unusual transparency policies, public financial reports, open book contract negotiations, employee profit sharing. Why these changes? Because secrets are expensive. They require energy to maintain. They breed distrust, and they usually exist to hide something unethical. Grace's voice carried conviction. Transparency isn't just moral, it's good business. When people trust you, they want to work with you. Your company has received several awards since the transition, but you've also been recognized personally as one of Charlotte's rising business leaders. How does that recognition feel? Grace smiled, remembering the uncertain woman who'd sat in a lawyer's office 8 months ago, convinced she had nothing to offer the world. Surreal, but earned. I spent years being told I was just a supportive spouse, just a hostess, just someone who happened to have good ideas occasionally. Turns out just was doing a lot of heavy lifting in those descriptions. What advice would you give to other women who might be in situations similar to what you experienced? Grace leaned forward, her expression serious. Document everything. Trust your instincts, and understand that someone else's opinion of your worth, even someone you love, is just an opinion. It's not a fact. She paused, thinking of all the women who'd reached out to her since the trial, sharing their own stories of manipulation and diminishment. Also remember that leaving someone who diminishes you isn't revenge, it's self-respect. And sometimes the best way to prove someone wrong about your capabilities is to stop asking for their permission to show them. After the interview, Grace returned to her desk to review contracts for the next quarter. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lauren. Saw the interview preview online. You're becoming quite the media darling. Dinner this weekend to celebrate? Grace typed back. Can't this weekend? Touring potential sites for the next affordable housing project. But yes to celebrating. How about lunch Tuesday? As the sun set over Charlotte, Grace began gathering her papers to head home. The house that had once felt like a museum to Elliot's success now reflected her own personality. Warmer colors, family photos, books scattered on surfaces, plants thriving in every room. She'd started dating again recently. Nothing serious, but it was remarkable how different it felt to be chosen by someone who knew her actual worth, rather than someone who saw her as a reflection of his status. Her phone rang as she reached her car. The number was blocked, but something made her answer. Grace? The voice was barely recognizable, hoarse, defeated, but she knew it was Elliot. You're violating the restraining order, she said calmly. I know, I needed to tell you something. Grace waited, curious despite herself. You were right, he said quietly. About everything. About what I did, about who I was, about what I took from you. I've been in therapy since Atlanta, and I finally understand what I destroyed. Grace felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, not even pity. Just a mild interest in where this conversation was heading. I don't expect forgiveness, Elliot continued. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that you were never the problem. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too broken to see it. Elliot, Grace said finally, I'm glad you're getting help. But this call isn't about me. It's about you trying to feel better about yourself. And that's not my responsibility anymore. I know, I hope you find peace. Grace interrupted gently. But please don't contact me again. She hung up and deleted the number from her call log. Whatever healing Elliot needed to do, it would have to happen without her participation. As Grace drove home through the city she was helping to reshape, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she'd thought her life was ending. Instead, it had been beginning. Her phone chimed with a notification, a LinkedIn message from a colleague in San Francisco, asking if she'd consider speaking at a national conference on sustainable urban development. 6 months ago, she would have automatically assumed she wasn't qualified. Tonight, she immediately began drafting an acceptance response. Grace Whitmore was no longer rebuilding her life. She was building the life she'd always been meant to live, one where her voice mattered, her ideas had impact, and her worth was never again subject to someone else's approval. And for the first time since she could remember, the future felt limitless. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, Grace Whitmore stood before a full-length mirror in her walk-in closet, a space she'd redesigned to reflect her own style, rather than what someone else thought looked appropriate on her. Tonight was the Charlotte Business Excellence Awards, and Grace had been nominated for Entrepreneur of the Year, not as someone's wife, not as a feel-good story about divorce recovery, but as a business leader who had transformed a company and inspired an industry. She'd chosen a midnight blue gown that made her feel powerful rather than decorative, Her reflection showed a woman who'd learned the difference between confidence and performance, between success and approval-seeking. The doorbell chimed, and Grace smiled as she opened it to find Ivy standing on her doorstep. The younger woman looked radiant, her blonde hair now cut in a chic bob, her makeup minimal, her smile genuine in a way it had never been during her Instagram days. "You look amazing," Ivy said, then paused. "I mean, you look like yourself, which is better than amazing." "So do you," Grace replied, and meant it. Ivy had started her own consulting firm helping other influencers transition away from performative online personas toward authentic businesses. It was smaller than her previous ventures, but sustainable and real. "Ready to go show Charlotte what a real power couple looks like?" Ivy asked with a grin. Grace laughed, linking arms with the woman who'd once been her husband's mistress and was now one of her closest friends. It was an unlikely friendship, born from shared experience and mutual understanding of what it meant to rebuild yourself after realizing you'd been living someone else's version of your life. The award ceremony was held at the Omni Hotel, in the same ballroom where Grace had attended countless charity galas as Elliot's accessory. Tonight she walked in as the guest of honor, with Ivy beside her and Lauren waiting at their table. The evening passed in a blur of congratulations, networking conversations, and genuine recognition for work that had once been invisible. When Grace's name was announced as the winner of Entrepreneur of the Year, the standing ovation felt like vindication for every woman who'd ever been told her contributions didn't matter. Grace Whitmore has transformed not just her own company, but our entire industry's approach to sustainable development and community engagement, the presenter announced. Her leadership proves that the best businesses are built on authenticity, transparency, and genuine care for the communities they serve. As Grace accepted the Crystal Award, she thought about the woman who'd sat in that courthouse 18 months ago, convinced she had nothing to offer the world except her ability to organize someone else's life. "This award isn't just mine," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "It belongs to every woman who's been told she's just a supportive spouse, just a behind-the-scenes contributor, just someone who happens to have good ideas." Tonight is proof that there's no such thing as just when it comes to recognizing your own worth. The applause was thunderous, and Grace saw women throughout the audience wiping their eyes. She'd become something she'd never expected to be, a symbol of what was possible when you stopped accepting less than you deserved. Later, as the three women sat in Grace's living room sharing wine and reliving the evening's highlights, Ivy raised her glass. "To Grace," she said, "for showing us all what it looks like when a woman chooses herself. To second chances," Lauren added, "and to the courage to take them." Grace lifted her own glass, looking around at the home that truly felt like hers now, at the friends who saw her clearly, at the future that stretched ahead full of possibilities she was finally brave enough to pursue. "To learning that your worth was never up for debate," she said quietly. "It was always a fact. Some of us just take longer to accept it." As Ivy and Lauren left that evening, Grace stood in her doorway watching their taillights disappear into the Charlotte night. Tomorrow she'd return to the office where her ideas shaped policy, where her decisions affected hundreds of employees, where her vision was transforming communities. But tonight she simply stood in her own space, wearing her own success, surrounded by relationships built on truth rather than performance. Grace Whitmore had learned the most important lesson of her life, that the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is refuse to be smaller than she actually is, and she would never be small again. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who claimed to love you? Could you find the strength to rebuild your entire life like Grace did? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose ourselves. Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.